The following is a conversation with Kate Edwards. I met Kate for the first time around the year 2011 when I was working in the City Engine team, and we had a booth at the SIGGRAPH graphics conference where we gave demos. Kate has a background in cartography and geography and has then found her way into the tech industry, where she worked many years for Microsoft, building up and then leading the company's division evolving around geopolitical and culturalization topics. Over time, these operations extended to all international Microsoft products and services, including many games. She then started her own consultancy, geography, and specialized further in games. With this combination of culturalization and games, she found her true passion and continued to do this ever since. Kate is a veteran and pioneer in the games industry. She's been involved in over 270 games in her career so far, consulting on all sorts of culturalization issues, as well as having been on the board as an executive for the International Game Developers Association and the Global Game Jam. Further, and more recently, she co-founded Set Chatters, a startup focusing on film set tourism, which is one of her longtime hobbies. Kate is a huge inspiration to many people, including myself, to learn and constantly look at things with different eyes and reflect on them, especially in the field of social topics such as diversity, inclusion, and culture in this age of globalization. Thank you, Kate, for your insights and your time and your seemingly never-ending energy to push the games industry and its politics forward. Stay humble, stay curious. This is the 3D Environment Podcast. And now, please enjoy the conversation with Kate Edwards. Awesome. Let's get started. Kate Edwards, it is a pleasure to have you on board with our episode 8. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
I would say let's get started with a little bit of fantasy. So I read that Tolkien had a huge influence on you as a kid. Can you tell us a little bit more about Tolkien's work and how it inspired you?
Absolutely. I think it was in 4th grade when I read Tolkien for the first time. Our teacher introduced the book series to us. And this was back in the 1970s when I was in elementary school. And back then, Tolkien's work had kind of had a big resurgence in the early to mid 70s. And so it was really popular. I mean, even in the area where I lived in Southern California, there's streets that are named after things from Tolkien, like Rivendell and Elrond and things like that. That's how popular it was in the time. So my teacher introduced the books to us and read them out loud. And then, of course, encouraged us to read them as well. And so I did, and then I basically ended up reading his works, every single year, all the way through high school into my early college days. So, I got extremely familiar with his work. And like many people, it was super inspiring to me. The world building is incredible. And, I think a lot of people still hold up Tolkien as sort of a gold standard of world building, from everything that he did, languages, cultures, the entire thing. So for me personally, the thing that I think inspired me the most was his map of Middle Earth. Because, he also kind of set a standard for other fantasy authors that from that point forward, if you have a fantasy book, you're going to have a map in your book. I mean, because he was, a friend of C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia series. C.S. Lewis included a map in his books as well. And then all the subsequent fantasy authors tend to include, some kind of map in their book. And for me, that really brought the world to life. As much as I loved the narrative and loved reading those books and all the characters and everything, it was really the map that kind of entranced me. and really kind of, it's just the same as a lot of people who love maps, especially when you're kids. You look at maps, you just can't, wonder what's there, how do I get there? Things like that. So that's really what it was. And, I honestly credit his map of Middle Earth as being one of the main inspirations for me to go into cartography, many years later, just because I wanted those skills. How do I make something like that?
You just mentioned cartography, and we're going to go into a little bit of a definition of words before or afterwards. So you just mentioned kind of the craft of making maps, which is cartography. But I would say, or I guess your background would be kind of, could you say that it's more in cartography or more in geography?
I would say it's a healthy mix of both, because most people who are cartographers, they became geographers. That's the field of study that you enter to study cartography, usually, at least in U.S. education. I entered the geography department and was pursuing a geography degree in my undergraduate work, with the intention of also picking up the cartography skills, because cartography is seen as one of the primary tools that geographers use as sort of the language of their craft, being able to explain to people where things are. And so you really kind of need one to have the other. So there's many people who, if they go into geography, they will typically pick up some cartography skills. In fact, when I was a graduate student at the University of Washington, they required all undergraduate students in geography must take cartography courses. You must know how to make maps, because that is essentially how geographers communicate for the most part.
Mm-hmm. No, that absolutely makes sense. So maps, I guess visually or kind of based on the observation, maps per se in Tolkien's work were the first inspiration to kind of go into this direction of, let's say, a profession. Were there also other factors?
I think for me, there were a lot. I have so many interests. When I was growing up, I just had a fascination with travel and with cultures. I think a lot of that was fostered from, growing up with my parents who were school teachers. And so they would have the summers off. And so typically every summer we had some kind of road trip. I grew up in Southern California, but then we often did road trips into anywhere in the West. Sometimes went up to Canada, sometimes to Mexico. In 1976, when the United States celebrated its bicentennial year, we actually did a 6-week road trip around the United States. And we were in Washington, D.C. on July 4th, 1976 to celebrate the 200th anniversary. And so that was just amazing, and I think all of those trips kind of really inspired me to be curious and to really be open-minded about experiencing other cultures and really kind of lit that fire for travel, because travel is essentially how you do that. Just as Mark Twain once wrote, he said that travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. And I love that quote. I used to actually have it on a T-shirt. And I think for me, having had all that experience as a kid growing up, something that I replicated with my daughter when she was growing up, I think that was a big factor in helping me make a decision to go into geography and cartography.
Yeah, I can completely relate to that. I've seen it myself when traveling for leisure and for business. I've seen also quite a few countries over time, and just being in contact with multiple cultures, it's one of those things that just opens you up as a person. I think it's one of the absolute best things you can do to gain knowledge, and in general just to kind of become a little bit more humble also.
Absolutely. Yeah, I could not agree more.
Yeah. Let's go to those definitions, because there are so many words that sound relatively similar, and we might come back and use some of those. Let's define them. So we had geography, we had cartography. Then there's geology, topography, and topology.
Yeah.
Let's go through them.
Absolutely. So geography, of course, is the study of the earth, and it's, we jokingly say it's one of the world's oldest professions. The study of the world and describing the world stretches back basically to the beginning of human civilization. So it's a very old science. And of course, making maps as an expression of our spatial knowledge just came right along with that. And, the oldest map in existence is one from Babylonia that's roughly about 6,000 years old. And I believe it's in the British Museum right now. I don't remember exactly, but it's amazing to see it. But then geology, of course, the study of rocks and the study of geomorphology and the structures of the earth and plate tectonics. And so basically the mechanics of the earth itself and the materials that make up the earth. That's actually my dad's field. He was a geology and earth science teacher in teaching science. So that was more his domain. Topography is the description of the shape of the ground. So it's basically how are the elevation differences. So how are there hills, are there valleys, and what a landscape looks like, and things like that. I mean, I think a lot of people are familiar with with topographical maps that use the different the line as a technique on there to essentially show elevation. And so that's basically what it's for, to show elevation differences. But then topology is also a really important concept, but it doesn't relate very much to topography, because topology is about the connectedness of things. So it's basically, it could be two physical things on the planet, like a mountain and a river. So what is the topological relationship between them? Well, it could be described as, well, the river exists because the water runs off the mountain. And so basically the river is formed by that runoff water that goes down a particular channel or valley. That's a topological relationship between the two. But we can also have topological relationships between ideas, between people. You could say, like, okay, my daughter and I'm her mom, and so there's a topological relationship that is defined. Like, how are we connected? I think it's a really important concept. I mean, you often hear topology used in network science for the internet, because they talk about how internet nodes are connected. So you'll often hear that term tossed around. But we use it also in geography as well, because we want to understand not just like the distance between things, but also the relationship between those things. Like, what defines the causal relationship or the thematic relationship between the two.
Yeah, and then it would also make sense that the word topology, for example, is very often also used in computer graphics, for example, talking about 3D environments.
Yes,
kind
absolutely.
of mesh topology and how polygons and so on are connected. All right. Now, moving on from those fields, kind of going back a little bit to your background, what motivated you to kind of extend into other fields, let's say, for example, the tech industry?
Well, I think one of my big factors there was the fact that I've always been interested in new technology. My original aspiration out of high school was to be an astronaut. And I actually wanted to be an astronaut. I did aerospace engineering for my first year out of high school, and the calculus just killed me. I'm too right-brained for calculus, I think. I definitely, geometry was the only math I ever did fairly well at, because I think of the spatial dimension of it. But yeah, calculus was just not my thing. And so I had decided instead that I wanted to do something more creative. And because I had artistic skill, I wanted to be a conceptual artist for Lucasfilm, because I wanted to work on a Star Wars movie really bad. And I really loved the conceptual art side of things and storyboarding and all of that. So I did industrial design for a couple of years to really hone those skills, which I did. I really improved them. But then I got a little disenchanted with the program I was in, and just decided, I had already been planning to get a minor in geography. And that's what I was just kind of convinced myself, well, if you're so interested in geography, then why not just do it? But that aside, I mean, I still always had a fascination with technology. My very first video game was Pong, because I was about 7 years old when the first Pong console showed up at a store near me. And so ever since then, I always was really fascinated with games and technology and computing. And one of my good friends was very much a computing geek early on. I mean, his dad was an engineer at Rockwell. And so his dad really encouraged his kids. They were a family of 5. He bought them their first, Apple II clone computer so he could do programming on it, things like that. And me hanging around him and hanging around that family was really a big factor in kind of my exposure to technology that my family could not afford. So that was really cool. And so it just gave me this constant interest in keeping an eye on evolving technology. That's why when I did my master's thesis in geography, I actually did it on the topic of using VR and AR for cartography. But this is back in 1991, where neither of those technologies really worked very well at all. But I saw the promise of it. I saw how well this could work in terms of capturing a more baseline understanding of how we think in a spatial environment and how we can make maps that are more intuitive for people because they're more experiential and they make more use of more of our human senses. So that was kind of what I was pursuing. And that really is a good example of what was interesting me. I still had my geography interests and culture and cartography and all that, but I really wanted to see how can I also pull in my interest in technology and emerging tech. And that was what I did. And the funny thing is when I suggested that topic to my thesis committee, they initially rejected it. And the reason they rejected, they said, oh, that's just video games. And of course, all of my committee, they understand I've now been working in games for over 30 years. So they kind of ate their words a little bit. But at the time, way back in the, around 1989, 1990, games were not as cool as they are now. And they kind of saw it as a waste of time. But I was happy to prove them wrong, and I did. So
you most certainly did. Very cool. Yeah, which obviously makes sense that eventually you would also get into kind of a technical field or to technical jobs. And so then obviously from your CV, you then worked at Microsoft for quite some time. So what were your roles there, and eventually how did you get to work on games?
So when I finished my master's degree, I started my PhD right away because I wanted to pursue that theme further and kind of, explore more, the whole virtual world's applications to cartography and geography. So I started that, but then right around that time is when Microsoft called the geography department at the University of Washington, and they were asking, hey, we need a cartographer to come over here and make some maps for us. So myself and one other individual, we went over and applied for the only one open position, and he ended up getting the job because he's a programmer and I'm not. I'm more from the cartographic design side of things. But then just a few weeks after he started the job, he calls me up and he says, hey, I really need your help because we need to make about 400 maps in the next 6 months. Wow. So we were building all of the original bitmap images for the Encarta Encyclopedia. So all the historical maps, all the reference maps. And so I'm like, sure, I'm a starving grad student who is recently married. And I'm like, yes, I could use the money. So I went over there and started what I thought was going to be a 6-month contract. And so we made all the maps for Encarta, and the V1 launched in 1993. And then they immediately renewed my contract for another 6 months. And they said, okay, that's great. Now we need you to go over here and work on this. And now we need you to work on this. And I was like, sure, the money was good and the work was really fun. I mean, being able to apply your knowledge in that context is really exhilarating, I would say. So I was having a lot of fun, but it got to the point where I had to essentially put my PhD on hold. I went on permanent leave on my PhD, which I had to renew every year because I was just having too much fun at Microsoft. Because after we did it, I became the cartographic lead for Encarta Encyclopedia, and then the Encarta World Atlas project was started, which I also helped conceive, which was the first vector-drawn globe. So this predates Keyhole and Google Earth by quite a few years. And so Microsoft had that technology. We had a vector-driven, 3D globe that we released as Encarta World Atlas. It's just that Microsoft was not as good at really leveraging what they had and getting it out there to the public in the way that Google later would be very good at. So we developed that technology. And so I basically, by the end of 1995, it was early 92 is when I started the contract work on Encarta. By late 1995, I was still a contractor almost 3 years later. And I was kind of getting pissed off. And I'm like, look, either give me a full-time job or I'm walking. And I'll just go back and finish my PhD. And so amazingly, overnight, they somehow found an open headcount. And they said, okay, here's, we have a job for you. I'm like, yeah, what a surprise. You could have done this 3 years ago. So, but anyway, I asked them, so what exactly do you want me to do? And they said, well, one of the things that we're not doing, and we're kind of not doing it formally, is catching the geopolitical sensitivities on the maps. We had a few little problems in Encarta Encyclopedia and Encarta World Atlas with a couple of government issues in Turkey and South Korea that got us into trouble a little bit. And so we need somebody watching this stuff like all the time, which I could do. That was part of my studies. I studied geopolitics, and it was definitely part of the cartographic work that I did, keeping track of what boundaries are disputed, what territories, what names on the map are disputed, things like that. So basically they said, write your job description and we'll hire you into the job. And it's exactly what I did. So I don't think that really happens much anymore there.
But so awesome.
So I called myself a geopolitical specialist at first, and later that title would be changed to geopolitical strategist. But that was my first job, my first full-time job at Microsoft. So I was working in the geography business unit, as it was called then. And this was back around, in 1995, 96, which was kind of really the golden age for geography at Microsoft. We had a business unit called Geography Business Unit. We had actual full-time geographers, hydrologists, cartographers working inside of Microsoft. We even had our own map library, this massive room with our own, map collection, and a full-time map librarian at Microsoft. And it was just amazing that we had all of those resources at our disposal, because Microsoft was making a really big bet on mapping products. Because not only did they make, like Encarta Encyclopedia and Encarta World Atlas, they also made streets and trips. And they made a business product called MapPoint, which is kind of what the product Tableau, which exists today, Tableau kind of took MapPoint's place. So there was a lot of mapping products we were working on. But as I was now in this full-time position, I started getting questions from all over the company because people started finding out that I existed. And so I would get queries from the Office team or the Windows team or some other, MSN or somebody. And they would say, hey, just all kind of esoteric questions like, is this flag accurate? Can I use this flag for this country? Is it okay to use the thumbs up gesture? Is it okay to use this color for that culture? And a lot of those questions, I could answer them easily. I either knew it already or I knew very quickly where I could find the answer. And so we actually created an internal alias at Microsoft called Dr. Ware. And so it was Dr. Ware at Microsoft.com. And so any employee could email Dr. Ware and get an answer to their geography or culture question.
That's
and
so cool. Love this.
So I
story.
guess I sort of unofficially got my PhD as Dr. Ware. And actually my name signs on my office at Microsoft, I actually had my name and then I had Dr. Ware underneath it, a second sign. And so that was really fun to do. So I did that for, a couple of years. But then in 1997, we had a huge problem that occurred in Encarta World Atlas where we had, I'm not going to go into all the details because it's going to take way too long to explain. But basically, we made a really serious error on the map of the North Korean-Chinese border. And it pertains to an area, a lake called Cheonji. And around the lake, it's a crater lake that it's up in the mountains there. And around the lake, there's the highest point of the rim is called Bakdusan, which is a sacred site to all Koreans, north and south. And so we accidentally put that entire feature inside of China, when in fact the lake is bisected by the boundary and Bakdusan sits on the Korean side. And it's a huge tourism spot for many Koreans. It's one of the only places that South Koreans are allowed to visit in North Korea because of the cultural significance. So we made that mistake because we were using data that was out of date, and it got us front page news in South Korea. It was very embarrassing. The government was not happy with us. However, the South Korean government, then the Ministry of Information, kind of went through all of Encarta looking for errors, things that they thought were historical, things that were wrong, or other facts that they considered to be inaccurate. Now, we didn't change everything they requested because, let's face it, some of the things they asked for were not considered to be factual outside of Korea. For example, they want the Sea of Japan to be called the East Sea. And that's what the term that Koreans use is East Sea or Tonghae. But we're not using that because most of the world says Sea of Japan. We did decide to double label the feature in Encarta. So we said, Sea of Japan and then parentheses East Sea. So at least we gave some recognition to the endonym, as we call them, the name used within a particular place. So anyway, the Korean government, we went through all that. We fixed the map issue. We found out what the correct boundary should be, fixed the issue. This was in August of 1997. And so we thought, okay, we're done. Great. We went through this storm. Everything's fine. Well, 3 months later, the very first Age of Empires came out. And Age of Empires contained a couple of scenarios that took place in Korea during the Middle Ages. And some of the things that were shown in that scenario were some of the issues that the government told us to fix, and we didn't fix them. And so when they saw this, they saw Age of Empires come out, they were livid. They were so angry at Microsoft because they were like, we just told you to fix all these things and you said you would fix them and you did not fix them, because now this other product came out with all these errors. Now, of course, what South Korean government doesn't understand is that Encarta was made in Redmond, Washington, at Microsoft headquarters, and Age of Empire was just made at Ensemble Studios in Dallas, Texas. There is no reason for these teams to talk to each other. They have no connection between each other, and they're physically very far apart. So there's no expectation that they would understand what just happened with Encarta Encyclopedia and Encarta World Atlas. So, but this gave me an idea. This showed one of the weaknesses we had within the company, which is this kind of risk is not being accounted for across all the product teams. And that gave me the idea to create a new kind of team at Microsoft, which I originally called the Microsoft Office of International Affairs, which is kind of a grandiose name, but I wrote a proposal for this office. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to try and get this thing created. So I started shopping this around to different VPs within the company. I started with my own VP in the group that I was sitting in, and I didn't get much luck there. And then I went through 3 others, and I just got rejected 3 more times. So I'm sitting on 4 rejections. But the reason I kept going is because I had a lot of people around me who said, we need this really badly. Please try and make this happen, including people in the games group. Because at that time, I had already been working in the background on some of the games at Microsoft, because those are some of the people who came to me, via the Dr. Ware alias, asking for help. So now, unfortunately, they didn't ask me about the Age of Empires issue. I could have fixed that before they released it, but that's another problem. So I was already connected with some of the games folks. I'd already worked on a few of the games. My first game I ever worked on was Flight Sim 5.0. So that was in 1993, because I had to fix some boundary stuff for them in there. But now, essentially, I was being encouraged to continue. So then I got to the 5th VP that I pitched to. And of course, by this point, my pitch is down really good. So I pitch it to him, and within like 3 minutes, he's like, great, let's do this. And nice. I'm kind of like, what? Yeah. Seriously? Yeah. Yeah. And I attribute a lot of the reason why he was so quick to approve it is because he was the only VP I talked to who was not from the US. He was from South Africa. And so I think he had a very clear understanding of the kind of risk that we were dealing with. And so he basically said, what do you need? What do you need from me? Let's make this happen right now. So within a week, I was in a new building, running a new kind of team with 3 people working for me. And I remember showing up that Monday morning in the new building. I'm like, okay, now what do I do? But that essentially created what I called, it was not called the Microsoft Office of International Affairs. It ended up being called geopolitical strategy, which I think made more sense for the company. And so I was now the senior geopolitical strategist running the geopolitical strategy team with people working for me, one of whom was in military intelligence. Another was from Nicaragua. She was a political science expert. And then I also had another person who was like a web and information specialist, because we had a whole internal website within Microsoft. We had a massive knowledge base. We actually ran internal events at Microsoft called World Passport. We did that for 2 years in a row to kind of get out the awareness to the rest of the company about the importance of these issues. And it made a massive impact. We even years later, we had people coming to us for help because they had attended a talk at one of those World Passport events. So we did a lot of stuff for a very small team. And one of my key roles was to basically interface with all the product teams at Microsoft. So I kind of went on this evangelism trail with my PowerPoint, presenting here's what's risky, here's why you need to think about these things. And I did that across the entire company. I also did a lot of visits to subsidiaries around the world because I needed their help. I needed their cooperation, because we formed quite a good partnership with the subsidiaries, because oftentimes the product teams back in Redmond would not listen to the feedback coming from the subsidiary. And if that was the case, then the subsidiary would often reach out to me and say, "Hey, can you please go tell this team, we need them to fix this or fix that." And so I would do that. I would physically walk to the person's office and show up at their door, say, "Hey, I have a message for you from Nigeria." So I basically ran the geopolitical team then for the next 7 years. And my goal was to institutionalize the thinking around geopolitical and cultural strategy across all the product teams in the company. And I felt we did a pretty good job, because in 2004, we were able to get into the master checklist, which is a checklist that every single product at Microsoft must follow. So if you want to release your product from Microsoft, whether it's virtual or physical media, you have to follow the checklist. Now, a lot of the requirements on the checklist tend to be technical, and there's also a lot of legal requirements that you have to follow. But I was able to get a line item into that checklist that basically accounted for geopolitical and cultural issues, and basically encouraged teams that you have to use the tools that we've created to help you do this. Once that was in that checklist, I kind of felt like my job was done. I had done exactly what I wanted to do. I had institutionalized this process at Microsoft. It had been well entrenched in the games sector and everything else. And that's why I ended up leaving the company in March of 2005. But just the last footnote on that, especially about the games part, I had started working on the games, like I said, early on, but then after I created this team, it really became more of a formal process. So that's when I started working pretty much on everything. So all the original Halos and Fables and Age of Empires and Forza and all the other stuff that Microsoft made back in those days, I worked on it. It was just, that's where I found my true calling. I'm like doing this kind of work, which I would eventually call culturalization. Doing culturalization work on video games, I found like this brings together everything I love: technology, culture, creative media, my geeky side. I mean, everything comes together in that work. And so that's when I left Microsoft in 2005. I did so with the intention of primarily focusing on video games. And that's pretty much been the case ever since.
It sounds like the perfect story to get to the perfect job. But I'm actually quite surprised that it is, or maybe just back then, it was possible to kind of create this almost task force or business unit or department that is actually kind of connected to all the products and to all of the services.
Yes.
So it's like kind of a backbone to the whole problem.
Yes.
I think that's really, really a very smart move that to get something like this rolling. It's really, really important.
It was a lot of work, I gotta say. I mean, it was fun, but it was also a huge uphill battle. A lot of the teams, I had a lot of support from the legal team at Microsoft, because the lawyers were often the default people that somebody would go to with these kind of problems. But the lawyers are like, this is not a legal problem. This is like a political, cultural problem. We don't handle that kind of stuff. Now, obviously, some of these issues can be legal, like, for example, the legal requirement in India that you must show the northern area of Kashmir as Indian territory. That is a legal requirement in India. So there are content laws out there, but for the most part, they would avoid it. So a lot of these kind of issues were just being dropped on the floor. And some people would point to localization and say, well, it's localization's job because they're doing language translation. But that's not what they're paid for. They're paid for language translation. They're, a lot of the translators are paid by the word. They're not paid to do this extra layer of cultural sensitivity. Now, they often did. I mean, they would give their suggestions alongside their language translation work, but that wasn't their primary job or focus. So a lot of things would get missed there as well. So that's where I saw that, because I was kind of in this space where I was working between the different teams, I saw what was missing. And, then that's why I was persistent in getting the team created, because I knew the company needed it. I had to keep convincing the company that they needed it.
Yeah. And also people that are doing, for example, just language translations in general, they might not be aware of all of the aspects of the current politics.
No.
Or even past politics that are going on, right? So that's also kind of not in their job description.
Not at all.
But
No.
still, it's, I guess, also for the audience, right? I think it's starting to think, or at least for me, starting to think about these problems, it can have a huge impact.
Mm-hmm. And that was it's actually one of the reasons why I used the term geopolitical as part of the team's name, is because at Microsoft, that dimension, especially government relations, was a massive part of what they focused on, because obviously the company being as large as it was and large as it still is, it needed to be very sensitive to how it was, essentially dominating marketplaces. And so it really had to rely on good government relations. And these kind of issues are part of the foundation of that good relation. I mean, like I said, with the example I gave with South Korea in 1997, those two back-to-back issues between Encarta World Atlas and Age of Empires basically almost made the Korean government shut off Microsoft for a while. And I don't mean just those products. I mean everything. Windows, Office, done.
Yeah.
And, when there were times where I had to debrief Bill Gates himself and Steve Ballmer about why one of our products was in trouble or why it was front page news. So I would have to go in front of them and explain to them what happened and give them a solution. And and that was, that talk about intimidating. That was intimidating.
Yeah, you would guess so. Yeah. You just mentioned kind of the geopolitical strategy and also the word culturalization in general in the business context. So let's focus a little bit on that, switch a little bit into this direction. So can you give us an overview of those topics and tell us how you discovered or got introduced to those? So just to phrase the terms again, geopolitical strategy and culturalization in business.
Yeah, so geopolitical strategy, that term essentially refers to how, especially in the business context, how are you as a company, or in that case, Microsoft as a company, how are they going to navigate the complexities between how they represent content and information between the different markets? Because obviously you cannot show the map the same way in India and China, just to use maps as an example, because they are part of a dispute. China claims part of Kashmir that India also claims, and the maps are mutually exclusive. So there's no way you can show them the same map. But a lot of people just don't know that. And you have to get it right, because you will be instantly banned if your map is incorrect. If you don't show Taiwan as part of China, or you don't show the 9-dash line that shows China's claim over the South China Sea, then your product will be instantly banned in China. And a lot of companies obviously do not want that to happen. So that's one of the reasons why I adopted the term geopolitical strategy, because at least within the context of Microsoft, it was well understood what the risk was. We cannot risk losing markets. So that's really what it was about. And plus the fact that, a lot of the work that I had to do was sometimes be a shuttle diplomat within Microsoft, because on some of these political issues, for example, the Taiwan and China offices would not talk about it with each other. They would not put it in email. They would not get on a call to discuss it. So oftentimes I had to be the one to physically go between them to basically work out an issue that we were having, and I can understand, especially in China, they did not want to commit it to writing because it could be potentially problematic for them. And the same thing happened with Israel and some of the Arab countries and other parts of the world where we had these sensitivities, and well, frankly, we still do. So I thought geopolitical strategy made a lot of sense in the context of what I was doing for the company. But once I left Microsoft, the term geopolitical and geopolitical strategy in the much bigger world has a completely different context. You can see like what a geopolitical analyst does for a company, and there's that is a kind of job that people can get, and it's a much different focus. A lot of those geopolitical analyst jobs are focused on security issues like physical security or information security and things like that. They're not focused more on like product strategy and marketing strategy. That's not really what their focus is as much. So that's why I felt, especially because so many people are familiar with the term localization, I decided to basically repurpose the term culturalization and use that to describe what I was doing. Because I didn't think that, when I first left Microsoft, I tried saying geopolitical strategy and all that, but it just wasn't resonating with people. But when I said culturalization and I explained what it was, that basically it's a broader adaptation of content. It's not just linguistic focused like localization. And this is a point of debate, I realize. I mean, I've talked with localization colleagues who will argue that what I do is a subset of what they do, and I would argue that it's the opposite.
Agree. I would completely agree.
Because to me, language is part of culture. It's not the other way around.
Yeah.
And they are very closely interrelated, of course, but I do think language is just one expression of culture, and that's why I think culturalization is a more broader concept. And so I started using that term, and then when I started using it when I left Microsoft in 2005, nobody was using it in this field. And I actually had some people push back on me because they said, well, you realize that this term has been used quite a bit in discourse around colonialism, which I did realize that because, we talk about like the French culturalization of West Africa and things like that. Yep. So it kind of had a slightly negative connotation to it, but I still felt that it was the most appropriate term to use. And I felt, well, I can do my part to make it be a positive term and reclaim it from colonial discourse. Mm-hmm. And so what's interesting today is that I've seen a lot of localization companies will put, on their websites that we also do culturalization work, which I think is kind of interesting because they were not saying that 19 years ago when I left Microsoft. So I don't know if that's just because I was trying to push the narrative or whatever it was, but I was pretty heavy-handed with using the term everywhere I went in my lectures and elsewhere. And so maybe it kind of helped, push it open. I don't know. But I just think that it's a better term to use because now we're talking about the holistic view of what makes, what goes into any kind of content. And when we look at games, especially the complexity of games, one of the things that I love about games that really resonated with me as a cartographer is that the process of cartography and the process of world building for a game are very similar. And I don't think a lot of game designers even realize that. But I was just lucky enough to come through the path of cartography to where I saw that, when I'm working alongside game developers and game designers, they're building their worlds and everything. I'm like, the process they're using is very similar to what a cartographer goes through because cartography, from my perspective, is about world rebuilding because we look at the vast world out there, the real world, and we decide what phenomenon we're going to replicate in a version of the world, either 2D or 3D, that then serves a specific purpose. It could be a topographical map, a thematic map, or whatever it might be. But we are selective at what we're deciding we're going to put into that new world image that we're building. And games are the same thing. Game designers have to decide what aspects of the world they need to include in their game that essentially fulfill the narrative purpose. If it's a realistic RPG like Skyrim or Tears of the Kingdom or something like that, it's a very realistic environment with mountains and fields and rivers and everything else. But there's a lot of worlds that are completely abstract and they don't need all of that either. Mm-hmm. But that thought process of how you go through selecting and generalizing the real world into a virtual space or a representative space, it's very similar. And so that's, I think, another reason why I found myself called to games as a medium is because I just saw so many similarities. And that's one of the things I do in my lectures is try and help game developers understand that the process they're using is similar to cartography. And there's actually principles and ideas in cartography that they can leverage that will actually help them build better worlds as they're making their games. So, and it really impacts everything. So like when I'm working on a game, like any of the BioWare games of the last 20 years I've worked on, I'm working on Dragon Age 4 right now, Dreadwolf. And, there's so much complexity in the world, it's just incredible complexity, from the physical environment, the buildings, the geomorphology, the architecture, the culture of the buildings, everything else, to the characters and the different races and ethnicities and all the other parts that are in there, the different political factions, religions, all of that stuff. And so it's a lot of stuff you have to go through and consider. And I love it. It just, to me, it just lights up my brain in the best way. And so it's a fun process.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to just listening to your examples and kind of the ramifications if you're not considering those things or not, let's say, if you're unaware of those dynamics, especially if you're kind of going back, right? With Microsoft, it's completely understandable that if you're an international company where you have all of those connections that you want to run smoothly, that makes sense. But especially as smaller, let's say, game studios or creative studios that don't you're not necessarily running business over country borders and over cultural borders. Yet, if you're, let's say, creating a game that you want to sell worldwide, you might not come to the conclusions that you should look into those things.
Exactly.
So it's super eye-opening. But addressing this point here, the topic, let's say, of culturalization, for example, how does this affect, for example, games story-wise or environment or map-wise and also version-wise? Kind of what's the direct impact on a production when you start considering or managing those things?
Yeah, that's a great question because there's so many ways that this process can affect them. There's a lot of things that we do. I'll give you one example from Star Wars: The Old Republic, the BioWare game. So in this one scenario, if you choose to play as a Sith, so you're an evil Force user, there was one scenario where you're encountering an NPC, a non-player character, and the task was to get information out of them. So in the original scenario, as it was written, is that you walk in and you see in this room and you see this NPC and you automatically, the player is not doing anything. You see a little cinematic. The player takes their telekinesis and throws the NPC against the wall, and then they start zapping them with force lightning to get them to talk. So without any agency from the player, now your character is suddenly torturing somebody. And then you go through the little BioWare dialogue tree where you're trying to get the information out of them. And as you're doing that, your character is still zapping them more and more because that's what a Sith would do. They're evil. And so the NPC is like starting to bleed and they've had like smoke coming out of their ears. And so I flagged it because I'm like, in some countries, the ratings boards are going to flag this as a serious problem because you are forcing the player to commit torture against somebody. You're not giving them a choice. And, we kind of went back to Lucasfilm with this, and they were like, well, hey, but that's what a Sith does. So you should just leave it alone. I'm like, that's true. I'm a Star Wars geek. I understand that. But these are not Sith people who are playing the game. They're humans in our world today, not in a galaxy far, far away. Yeah. So, we have to accommodate that sensitivity. So instead of forcing the player to torture right away, we, because BioWare has that amazing, decision tree system, we added a decision where you can just pay the NPC instead. So you can just pay them right away and get the information out of them, which is, no, it's not exactly what a Sith would do. And they still had the cinematic be so that the Sith is kind of aggressive and in their face and being kind of angry and evil at them, but they didn't automatically torture them. Mm-hmm. That is an option, though, because we also have to remain true to the original IP and to the universe that Lucas created, because we can't violate that either. So you have to walk that fine line of trying to make sure that you're accommodating the creative vision of the original universe, but you got to make sure it works in our universe with our players. And so we make decisions like that all the time. There's oftentimes it's very surgical, the work that I do. So it's not like I'm looking at an entire game and throwing it out saying, no, you can't make a game like this. In fact, that's only happened twice in my entire career of 31 years in the game industry where I flagged the concept and saying, don't do this. This is going to be such a problematic game. But for the most part, it tends to be very surgical in nature. There's so many things I've worked on. I'm trying to think of other examples where it was one thing. Fallout 3 is a good example. So I worked on Fallout 3. One of the things in the environment of the post-apocalyptic Washington, D.C. was a two-headed Brahmin bull. And that is the reason why the game was never released in India, because Brahmin bulls are sacred to people of the Hindu faith. And there's actual laws in India that protect real Brahmin bulls from being harmed. And so there was enough concern, both culturally and legally, that those laws might be applied to this virtual representation of a Brahmin bull, which showed this kind of emaciated, two-headed, mutated, radioactive bull that is very sickly, because, hey, it's Fallout. And so we felt that that was too high of a risk. We did not want to, upset an entire country and people practicing that faith. So we did go back to the developer and said, hey, can you swap out that bull for something else? A two-headed horse would have worked perfectly fine, for example, but their schedule did not accommodate that. And unfortunately, at the time, they also felt that India was not important enough of a gaming market to make that change. I think they would make a different decision today. I think they would change it today, but back then, they just felt, back then they just felt that it wasn't worth the trouble and the potential risk to the technical build. So they left it in. And that is the entire reason why the game never released in India, was because of that two-headed Brahmin bull. I've worked on dancing games where I'm looking for gestures and body language that can be sensitive. I've had to tweak a lot of gestures that are used in some games. The thumbs up gesture is the same as the middle finger in some countries. There's just so many things around gestures. But it's subtle. It's really subtle. And that's my job, is to look for the triggers. My job, as I've joked with some of my clients, is to be really paranoid and to think of like the most subtle thing that somebody will complain about. Because let's face it, in today's world, especially with social media, people will always complain about anything. And so your job is not to remove all potential for complaint, because that's impossible. Your job is to basically decrease the amount of potential complaint. So if you're talking about 10 people or 100 people who are angry about something you did, that can be mitigated compared to having 10,000 or 50,000 people scream at you on Twitter, which is a whole different dynamic. Yep. And so there's always weighing the risks. And so I do a triage process when I'm looking at a game. I go have a risk assessment. I have a severity level that I apply to everything that I find. Like I'm working on the Indiana Jones game right now that comes out later this year, which has been super fun to work on because I'm a huge Indiana Jones fan as well. And like one of the things I've done for that game is they sourced through me a couple of archaeologists in different parts of the world to help them with the authenticity of the representation. And so this is another angle that I work on, where this is a case where we're trying to do the very best job possible in showing an authentic culture, especially a historical culture. That's why they have archaeologists making sure that every artifact is exactly the way it's supposed to be. The environments in which the character goes are exactly the way they're supposed to be, as a lot of these are real world locations that are represented in the game. So we want to make sure we're accurate and respectful of that culture and its history. So there's just so many different things. I mean, I was dealing with one client recently where they had an expansion map for one of their games. It's a first-person shooter, and the map looks remarkably similar to areas in the Middle East. And because of what's going on in Israel and Gaza Strip right now, there's a lot of concern that people are going to see the map and they're going to just assume that the map is a replication of what's going on in Gaza Strip. And obviously, they absolutely do not want that perception at all. But at first glance, especially if you're not a player, if you're like a politician or someone from the media and you happen to see like a screenshot of that map, you could easily make that conclusion. It's the wrong conclusion. So now we've had to go in and dress up the environment and take extra steps to make sure that it cannot be perceived that way by adding, more indications of what culture actually inhabits this place, because the map is not anywhere close to the Middle East. So there's so many things like that I work on at any given time. And I mean, it can generally affect almost everything in the content. One last example I'll give you is when I was working on Halo 2, one of the characters in Halo 2, people if they've never played Halo 2, basically this sci-fi futuristic game takes place, I think, in the 26th century, if I'm somewhere in the far future. One of the characters in the game was from this alien group called the Covenant. And the Covenant is a quasi-religious group. It is run by 3 prophets, one of whom is called the Prophet of Truth, which is an often used synonym for Muhammad. So we were concerned about that. But I was willing to let that go because Prophet of Truth can arguably and defensibly be said, well, that's a generic term you could apply to any religious figure. But the problem was that one of the characters from that alien group was called the Dervish originally. And Dervish is a term that is very specific to Sufi Islam. And so we felt that by using Dervish, you are instantly setting up an allegory where the Dervish is serving the Prophet of Truth in a quasi-religious alien group whose goal is to basically destroy all sentient life in the galaxy by doing what? By turning on these halo rings, which are essentially giant WMDs. And who's trying to stop them? This American soldier, the Master Chief, super soldier. He has an American voice, even though it says UN, UN Space Command on his shoulder, but it's an American. And this was also the first major title that was coming out after 9/11 from Microsoft in its game space.
This is a bad combination altogether.
It's a very bad combination.
Yeah.
So you're setting up an allegory, and I actually tested the allegory on some of my colleagues in the Middle East without telling them anything.
Yeah.
I just kind of presented them, what do you see here? Or do you see anything here? And, I had more than one person say, oh yeah, I see a revenge fantasy, the United States getting back at Islam. I'm like, okay, thanks. That's what I needed to hear. So basically what I had to do was ask them, don't use the term dervish, because I think dervish is the key, because it's basically that helps set up the allegory. Yeah. You're not going to change the Master Chief's voice. You're not going to change Prophet of Truth. But if you change dervish, you kind of help break the allegory a little bit. And that was a big fight that we had back and forth that took months to resolve. But eventually that's why that character became the Arbiter. As he has been known in the Halo universe now, which I personally think is a far better name for the purpose he serves within the narrative of the game. But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where it's just one name. Everything else in the Halo 2 game was perfectly fine, but that one name was the issue. And that's a very, very exemplary of the kind of things I deal with on a daily basis.
It's crazy, right? But if, let's assume something like this wouldn't be caught, and nobody realizes it, maybe not even with bad intent, but something like this gets released, right? This can go really wrong. This can go really, really wrong. And so I got a question here noted, what can be the impact on a business if culturalization is ignored? But this can go technically beyond even bankruptcy, right?
Well, it can, especially for smaller companies. I mean, so a company like Microsoft or Sony, Nintendo, they have huge resources to absorb this. They've got armies of lawyers to help them fight this. But for any other game company, even a small to medium-sized studio, this could be the death of their company to have something like this happen. And I'll give you one more example that I think kind of really shows how serious this can become. Well, I'll give you three. The two are super quick. One is like an Encarta encyclopedia. On the map that I made of Turkey, I put the label Kurdistan in southeast Turkey because that is technically a region within Turkey, although back in the 90s, that is a very sensitive topic because the PKK, the terrorist group from Kurdistan, was doing bombings and whatnot. And so Turkey had this massive campaign to push back on Kurdish independence. And so by putting Kurdistan on the map, that was a very strong political statement. And because we did that, our general manager of Microsoft Turkey was thrown in jail. And so the government basically said, take the label off the map or he doesn't come out of jail. So of course we took the label off the map, but we did not remove the topic from the encyclopedia. You can still find the Kurdistan article, but we had to take it off the map. Similarly, in Microsoft on Windows, somebody had changed Taiwan in one of the country region drop-down lists. They changed it to Republic of China, which is a very problematic term to use for Taiwan if you're going to sell your product in China. And so because that happened, the general manager of Microsoft China was taken away for a couple of days for questioning by the state police over the issue of subversion of the state. And for something he had nothing to do with. And we later found out that the person who did it, who lived back in Redmond, they did it because they were married to someone from Taiwan. And they were very sympathetic to the Taiwan independence cause. And they decided to use Microsoft as their platform for their own political statement. So these things can get serious. Very serious. I mean, one of the most complicated things I ever had to deal with was a game called Takakudo Chojin, which most people have never heard about because it was only on the shelves for a few months before Microsoft globally recalled the game. The reason that happened is because they had in the game an audio file that contained chanting from the Quran. And it was just, kind of this really nice lyrical chanting. Now, the problem is that the game designers used that audio file not knowing what it was. They just said, well, it sounds cool. and nobody investigated what it was or what the lyrics were actually saying. So they put it in the game, and then as the game was being released, it was not on the shelves yet, but it was in the process of being released. So there were already packaged copies moving on their way to stores, and somebody brought the file to me in my office and said, "Hey, someone said I should have you listen to this." So I listened and I said, okay, well, I think it's Arabic, as far as I could tell. So I fortunately worked in the same building as a good friend of mine who is actually from Kurdistan, who's an Arabic linguist. So I took it down the hall to him and I played it for him. And I said, "Can you tell me what this is?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, this is like a stanza that's from the Quran that gets repeated every once in a while." I'm like, okay. And so he's like, "So where did you find this?" So I told him the context. I said, "It's an M-rated, violent, hand-to-hand fighting game that's coming out on the Xbox." And as I'm explaining it to him, he's shaking his head like, no, you can't do this. I'm like, well, I kind of figured that already. I quickly emailed all the general managers of the Microsoft Middle East region to ask them to tell me, "I need you to tell me to stop this. I need it in writing." So by the next day, I get about half of them write me back saying, "Hey, please don't do this. Please change it." I took that information back to the game team and said, you need to change this." And they said, "Yeah, no problem. We will." And they did right away. They swapped it out for another piece that had no lyrics. However, there was about 75,000 copies already packaged and on their way to stores. And so I said, "Well, you're going to recall those, right?" And they're like, "No, we're not." And I said, What? They said, "Oh, we're only going to release them in the United States." And I said, "You realize that the United States is not a homogeneous society. There's millions of Muslims living in the United States." But they didn't listen. So they released the game in the US. And then a few months later, like clockwork, we got a letter from the Religious Council of the Saudi government. Basically, it was the equivalent of a cease and desist letter addressed to Bill Gates personally, that basically you've offended the Muslim faith, and because of what you've done. And so it became front page news in Riyadh. It became front page news in Dubai, and it started spreading like crazy in the region. So eventually, the head of the Microsoft Middle East region asked me to come over and help do damage control because they didn't know what to say. They had, again, the subsidiary is the victim of decisions being made back in headquarters. Mm-hmm. So I got approval from my manager to go over there. So I went to Riyadh. I actually landed in Riyadh 2 days after the second Gulf War had just started. So that was interesting. I went before the Religious Council or representatives of them. And basically, to make a long story short, I essentially ended up apologizing to them on behalf of Microsoft for what happened after they had asked me many questions that had nothing to do with the game. So like the very first thing that was said to me, not even an introduction, they said to me, "We want you to know that we don't hate Americans." And I'm like, I have no idea where this conversation is going to go. But they had a whole list of things they wanted to ask me first. So the first question is, why did Microsoft open its first Middle Eastern office in Israel and not an Arab country? That was their first question to me. And I had these guys on each side of me from the Microsoft office who were whispering in my ears saying, "Don't answer that question. You're only here to talk about the game." Next question, why did Office 97 release in Hebrew before Arabic? Again, no answer. I'm not going to answer that. Next question, why did Outlook implement the Jewish calendar before the Islamic calendar? Question after question after question until finally they got to the game, in which case I was prepared. I had a statement. I read it. I basically apologized on behalf of Microsoft and I explained to them what my job is at the company. Now, to be honest, in my head, I was on their side because I was just as angry at Microsoft as they were because the people did not listen to me.
Yeah,
but of course,
rightfully so.
But my job is to be a diplomat and not to basically take their side. But I was empathetic with them. I'll put it that way. And so after I made my statement, they kind of broke out into kind of a heated conversation in Arabic. And then the main person turned to me and said, "Thank you for your time." And they all just left the room. And then I had, the Microsoft guys are like, "Let's get out of here." So I had asked, "What just happened?" And they said, "Well, they were discussing whether or not your answer was sufficient." And I'm like, "Well, what would have happened if it wasn't?" And they shrugged like, "We don't know." I'm like, "Okay, so when does my plane leave?" So yeah, I mean these issues have very serious implications that can stretch far and wide. And in that particular example, we knew that we had to appease the Saudi government because as Saudi goes, so does many other Islamic countries. They are the seat of the faith, and if they decided, for example, to ban Microsoft's games or products or whatever, a lot of other countries who are predominantly Muslim would follow suit and do the same thing. So we basically had to make them happy as best as we could, and I think we achieved that. But yeah, that was quite an ordeal.
Yeah, I mean, especially in the context of what you just mentioned, kind of the Gulf time wars. It's not really just in general geopolitical kind of times. This doesn't help either.
No, it doesn't.
Oh wow.
So yeah, I mean that's always the thing we have to consider with these culturalization issues is the context. It's not just about what's in the product. It's not just about what's in the game. It's not just about the composition of the team who's making it or who you're asking for expertise. It's also about the market conditions as the game is releasing. So that's often one of the things I have to look at is what does it look like 2 years from now in that market when the game is actually going to be available, because as we know today, all it takes is one election or some regime change and things can change radically in a country. And so we have to be really careful about that kind of thing. And that's just one of the other parts of the job that I have.
Yeah. You also kind of mentioned it before, right? So companies like Microsoft or Lucasfilm, in the context of the Indiana Jones research, that they can afford the specialists, but especially in the games market, where especially smaller games that don't have the funds to finance kind of this type of research, and because of the huge amount of competition, are kind of almost forced to produce content that is a little bit, let's say, more edgy to have a chance to survive in the games market. So kind of
Yes.
these two elements themselves don't really help either in kind of avoiding those risks.
Well, I think that's one of the key things where it comes down to the question of values and what values you have as a creator and what you're willing to stand for or not stand for, what you're willing to change or not change. And that's a really important aspect of this whole process. And it's often comes up a lot when I'm having conversations. I mean, there are many times where we started with a very specific content issue. Let's say it's a character design or a symbol or something that's going to be put into the game environment. And then it becomes a much broader conversation about what do you stand for? And oftentimes that's where it goes up to the C level of the company, the executive leadership, because they're the ones who are supposedly defining this. I actually asked Bill Gates at one point at Microsoft, who is the moral compass of Microsoft? Because I need to know what Microsoft stands for and not stands for. And you know what he said? He said, "Oh, well, that's your job."
Wow, quite a burden.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't think I'm paid enough to be the moral compass of Microsoft. So,
yeah.
but the subtext there was that I'm expendable, because you cannot have executive leadership like Bill Gates publicly setting the moral compass of Microsoft. The shareholders won't stand for it because all he has to do is make a wrong decision and the stock just completely goes down. That's what he has other people for. Now, somebody in my position within the company, they could just blame it on me and say, yeah, we have a special team that handles these kind of things, and the person, our main subject matter expert, made a bad call. They're no longer here anymore, but we'll do better in the future. They just eject me out the airlock and just find somebody else. And that makes it a lot easier. But I think it's changed today, because I think today a lot of companies are being held accountable. That is one of the few values, in my opinion, of social media, is that it actually has been effective in making companies accountable, because a lot of the companies I work with today, I would say about half of them do it. They do the culturalization work, they do the inclusivity work and all of that because they truly believe in it. Their values include doing that kind of work and being respectful of your local customer and your player. The other half do it because they're terrified of social media. They cannot they cannot and do not want to see their name come up in a Twitter storm and calls for boycotts and all that kind of stuff. They just don't want that negative PR. And so they're doing it kind of out of fear rather than out of what I would consider to be the better approach, which you're doing because it's not only the right thing to do, but it's better for business.
Yeah.
And it's a struggle. A lot of companies struggle with this.
So if you could give me an example of another positive incentive to look into culturalization or invest into it. So not only kind of to maximize the market and kind of minimize the, let's say, potential social backlash. And obviously this is linked to company values, but what other incentives do you see that are positive?
Well, the biggest one I think is to be blunt, it's make more money, which is what a lot of businesses want.
Yeah.
When I first started doing this work inside of Microsoft, and then later after I left Microsoft, I started, when I started out, I was using the argument that you're doing it because it's basically the right thing to do. You're respecting the local expectations of your customers, and you're basically trying to provide them with a very positive experience. That argument does resonate with people, but it does not resonate as well as money. And so I had to find a way to basically make the money argument around this. And I was disappointed that that was the case, but that's the reality of business because business is about making money. So what I did instead is I pivoted a little bit in my messaging and I tested it out, especially in my early days as a consultant. And I found the phrase, which is the phrase of my own consulting company now, that when I would talk to people about what I do, and I say I maximize your global reach. And when I use that phrase, I kind of see that little light go on in their eyes. And I can read body language pretty well. And I could see that the people are like, they got it. Now they understand it. So because they're like, okay, you maximize the global reach of my content. That would be great. How do you do that? And then I can explain how I do that by making sure that, you're covering things that may not be problematic. And you can also not only think about reactive culturalization, which is a lot of the examples I've given, which is like the finding the negative or offensive things that could be a problem. You can also do proactive culturalization, which is effectively thinking about ways to enhance the experience for a specific market or culture, which a lot of companies are starting to do these days. So when I explain to them that as you culturalize products, just as is true in localization, because a lot of companies have made a lot of money on localizing their products. They make in some cases, far more money from the localized versions than they do from the original, like English or whatever the original language was. And the same is true with culturalization. So if you can go even further and do more adaptation, you will maximize your global reach. And so once I understood that argument worked, that's the argument that I leaned into. It is a money argument, but I think more importantly, especially for game creators and creative media, yes, they want to make money, but just as important to them is exposure. They want their games to be played by as many people as possible because they worked their asses off for, 2 to 3, 5 years, whatever it was, creating this world and creating this experience, and they want nothing more than to have just everybody play it. Yeah. And so this is another way. So it's not just about the money, it's also just about making sure that your vision will be as compatible as possible so many people can enjoy it.
Yeah. And one more side that is definitely positive that I also see is that when looking into all of those details, you're also kind of sharpening the vision or this kind of the story, and you make also the story more consistent or kind of congruent to whatever the world is that you're building.
Yeah, and that's one of my goals as well. I mean, it's honestly, that's a concept that is called logical consistency. And it's a concept that comes from spatial data science. Where we're looking, when we have a spatial data set, for example, let's say we have a data set of elevation. If we know it's an area that's like more of a flat plain, like a floodplain somewhere, and there's one point, so let's say most of the floodplain is between 500 and 800 meters in elevation, but let's say there's one point point that's in the middle of the data set that's at 1,000 meters or 2,000 meters, but it's only one point. That one point of data is logically inconsistent with the rest of the data. So it probably was a mistake. It could have been a rounding error. Who knows what happened during data collection? So we have to look at that and say, well, that's incongruous with what the expectation was. And I think that's part of what we're looking for, is things that are logically inconsistent in the environment. Because there is a way that the world works, that our natural world works, that we are used to as human beings. And we kind of know the systems, the day and night, the weather systems, the seasons, all of these systems. And as you build the game world, and if you have systems in place, it kind of resonates with our natural ability to respond to that. And we also respond very quickly to things that are not, that we can tell are not supposed to be there. And so that whole concept of logical consistency is something that comes up a lot in the world building process, because it's something a lot of times they don't think about. You could even argue, going all the way back to Tolkien, that is there certain things that are not logically consistent in Tolkien? I don't know if that's the case. I mean, for example, I would look at the way that the mountains around Mordor are shaped with right angles. I would say I cannot explain the plate tectonics that would have created that kind of thing. However, within Tolkien's universe, I could say, well, when Morgoth went down to that area, to Mount Doom and all that, he could have used his magical powers to raise a wall of mountains around him because he was that powerful. Maybe that's what happened. I don't know. But that explanation would be logically consistent with Tolkien's universe more than the plate tectonics of that world.
Yeah. I mean, it's also impossible to know all arts and all cultures, right? So there's always also this risk of stepping into these types of traps. So which would you say are the most common culturalization topics in games, and or that you typically have to address, and which sources to find information about the topics do you typically recommend?
Well, I would say, two of the biggest topics that I deal with in culturalization work is, one is what I would call allegorical distance, which I'll explain, and the other is cultural appropriation, and they are interrelated concepts. These are the two things that happen so often in my work, almost all the time. So cultural appropriation, of course, I think all of us have heard that term before. And, essentially to do more of the academic definition, it's when a more dominant culture tends to use elements from a subordinate culture and uses them in a way that is out of context from that other culture. And so, this often relates to colonialism. It relates to European cultures that are using, design elements or other things from, for example, indigenous cultures from different parts of the world. We've seen a lot of examples of cultural appropriation in recent years, because I think more and more game designers, as they're building their games and building their worlds, they're looking to new inspiration, which is great. That's what they should do. They should be looking constantly at other cultures in our world and getting inspiration from them. But the problem is, when they directly borrow the elements from those different cultures and put them into their games and use them out of context, that's when it becomes a big problem. A great example of that in recent years has been the Maori tattoos, because the Maori from New Zealand, the Maori people have very distinctive arm tattoos. They also have something called the tomoko, which is the tattoo that's on the face. These tattoos have a very significant spiritual meaning and cultural meaning for them. They're not intended to be used by non-Maori people, and yet you see a lot of people in public who are wearing, who have Maori tattoos. I think they had them done probably not knowing that these are more reserved symbols for that culture. But I've seen a lot of games use Maori tattoos on non-Maori characters, and it's just that would be considered inappropriate. Now, and there's a lot of examples of that. That's just one example. But what's interesting is that oftentimes that the people who are calling cultural appropriation are not the people from that culture. They're often, to be quite honest, tend to be white people, and often in the United States, who are basically saying, hey, you can't do that. That's from this indigenous culture. Now, I do think they're right to call it out, but at the same time, their act of calling it out also runs the risk of sounding like white saviorism, because that is also a problem where that's the whole basis for colonialism, where, the white Europeans went into Africa and Latin America and elsewhere saying, well, hey, we're going to help you out. We've got this whole system. We're going to culturalize you into our ways. We're going to give you this and give you that, but you're going to have to do it our way. There's kind of a similarity to when you have white people on Twitter saying, hey, that's cultural appropriation. I'm trying to protect this group over here. Now, if you ask the people from that group, oftentimes I would say like at least 75% of the time, the answer I get from them is more of positive. It's like, oh, wow, look, we're actually represented in the game. That's really cool, because normally we just get ignored. But they will often follow up and say, it's not perfect what they did, and they could make changes for the better, but it's also really cool that we're in the game, because otherwise we're just like completely ignored all the time. So it's always kind of that weight of like, behind, having the exposure and having the representation, which a lot of companies are striving for. And I think oftentimes their intent is good. They do have a good intent, but as the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So even though they have a good intention, oftentimes they make the mistake of simply not asking people from that culture, hey, we're going to do this. We want you to take a look. And that's why there's been a lot of sensitivity readers who have basically entered the workforce from different cultural groups, who basically advise content creators on the right way to do it. And I think it's great. I think it's a great trend to see, because we need more of that. But even more importantly, we need more companies who are actually seeking that out. But I think that's been happening a lot, and more companies are understanding that that's the standard. You do not borrow anything from any culture without asking them and getting their input. But this also relates to the idea of allegorical distance, which is a term that I use. I don't know if anybody else does, but it's the term I use, because oftentimes the reason why developers are looking to these other cultures is because they want to essentially build an allegory within their game. This is especially true of fantasy games, where you'll have cultures inside a fantasy world that emulate a real world culture in some way, because it kind of gives us as players a reference point. So we kind of understand what the creators are going for. For example, any desert environment I have ever seen in a fantasy game has the people looking like what? They look like Bedouins from the Arabian Peninsula, because that's just what you expect to see in a desert environment. At least in Dune, even though they kind of emulate that in Dune, at least they have still suits, which is a pretty distinct thing, unique to the Dune universe. It's fine to start with that inspiration, but then you have to do, because you're building an allegory. You're saying these people in the fantasy world are sort of like those people that you've seen in the real world. But allegorical distance is all about the concept of making sure there's enough distance between the inspiration and the implementation, which is oftentimes where the problem lies. And so that's one of the many things I look at when I'm looking at character designs or architecture designs. Like there's a game I'm working on right now in which the level of cultural appropriation was pretty extreme. Even I was shocked, and I've seen it all. So I had to advise them very strongly that you can start with that inspiration, but you've got to make modifications to it so that you're not copying, like just blatantly copying that culture, because it's not that culture. They basically are putting it into a fantasy world. So you want something that kind of feels like that culture, but it cannot be that culture. You've got to use different designs and different design elements and things like that. Like in one case, they were using elements from a Central American culture, which are very blocky and right-angled, kind of things in their designs. And I said, well, what if you use the same kind of style made out of stone, but use hexagons? Because that's a shape that you rarely ever see in ancient artwork. You don't see hexagons, and that would make it instantly feel different. And so the creative team, they can go and decide to do whatever they want to do, but that's the kind of advice I would give them to kind of help make sure that they build in that allegorical distance, because otherwise what's going to happen, they release the game without any changes, and people from that culture are going to see it and say, hey, what happened? I mean, this is our culture, it's our language, it's, and yet you're treating it like it's not us. You're turning us into some kind of weird fantasy culture that has nothing to do with us, and that's just not cool. And they have every right to be upset. I don't blame them one bit. So that's why those are two topics that are pretty common and pretty hot, I would say. There's a lot of other things too, but those are the ones that I would say are kind of the biggest challenges for companies right now.
Yeah. Cool. All right, let's move a little bit in the direction of your advocacy work. So next to your consultancy work, you've been running the IGDA for 5 years and the Global Game Jam for 3 years. How did you get into those roles?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I ran the IGDA for 5 years from 2012 to 2017. And then I ran the Global Game Jam from 2019 to 2022. And so for the IGDA, I joined the International Game Developers Association right after I left Microsoft because as I mentioned earlier, I had a desire to work directly more on games. And I felt, well, if I joined the IGDA, that would be a good way to do that and to meet more game developers and people who are in that space. And so I joined and kind of laid low for a while. I attended some of the IGDA Seattle meetings, but they weren't very active at the time. Eventually, a couple years later, I founded the IGDA Localization Special Interest Group because there wasn't one. And I felt that there needed to be a place for people who do both localization and culturalization, which I don't know other people who do culturalization. I only know people who do localization, but I felt there needed to be a place where we could all talk together, because when I would go to events like GDC or Gamescom, I would hang out with localization people because their job is somewhat close to what I do. And oftentimes I would hear people complain that, oh, nobody cares about localization. They always wait till the last minute. Nobody understands what we do. And so I don't like whining. So I said, well, let's create a group where we can educate non-localization people on why we exist and why we do what we do. And that's exactly what I did. So I ran that group, and it still exists to this day. And then I also helped revive the IGD Seattle chapter and helped lead that chapter for a few years. And then in 2012, I was approached by the board of directors of the IGDA about the executive director job. At first, I was kind of getting burned out on the IGDA because I felt that they were not doing what they should do, because the organization was formed in 1994 to be an advocacy organization for game developers. Because in the same year in the United States, that's when the Entertainment Software Association was formed to basically represent the interests of game companies in Washington, D.C., and to be lobbyists with the government. Because, back in 1994, the U.S. government, there were certain figures like Jack Thompson who were very anti-video games, like very strong. And so the ESA was formed. That's also when the ESRB, the ratings board, was formed in 1994. But then the IGDA was formed by game developers to represent our interests, not the interests of companies. And so I thought that was great, but they were supposed to be a vocal advocate for game developers, and I felt they were really not doing their job the way they should. So when I interviewed, I first did an interview with part of the board about this job, and honestly, I didn't really want it. I just wanted to voice my opinions to the board directly, and I let them have it. I really kind of blasted them very strongly. And I said, you need to fix this, and you need to do this, and you need to fix this by this time. So I was very specific and very adamant with them about things they needed to fix. Well, I got off the phone, and the recruiter called me and he said, oh, you're going to be one of the finalists. I know it, because nobody ever talked to them that way. And so sure enough, I eventually got the job, because part of my desire was, at that point, I'd already been working with game developers for quite a while, and I love these people. I love working with game developers. I empathize with them in so many ways. They are my people, so to speak. I really feel that way. And I wanted the industry to be a better place for them because of working conditions and doing crunch and lack of diversity and other problems in the industry. I really felt strongly that I could at least voice those concerns on their behalf a lot better. And that's why I took the job. And so I felt over the 5 years I ran the IGDA, we did a better job of elevating a lot of these concerns. I also happened to be running the IGDA during the time of Gamergate, which started in 2014. So I was one of their primary targets of their misogyny campaign. So unfortunately, because I had woke up to death threats and harassment for over 2 years straight, because of that, But I wasn't silenced. I still did what I felt I had to do. I often challenged these people to meet me at an event where I was speaking and talk with me in an intelligent way, because I was not going to argue with them on Twitter. But they never did. That's not what they're, they like being anonymous. They don't want to have an honest conversation. So I felt, we're just going to keep pushing the message forward, because I knew that we were on the right side of history in terms of these issues. So basically, after 5 years, I decided it was time to go, and I told the board this when I took the job in 2012. I said, if I cannot get things where I feel they should be in 5 years, then I think it's time for somebody else to try. And so, that's what happened. I had a great time doing it. It was fun. It was a lot of challenges though. But when I left the IGDA, basically I had concluded that what the industry really needs is that we need better leverage for developers, whether it's a union or a legal defense fund or something. We need something stronger than the IGDA to help developers. And as we've seen this last year in the game industry, which was racked by layoffs across the entire industry, I think even now it's very clear that we need better protection of some kind. And so that interest in creating a union or doing something has not been lost on me. And it's still something I'm interested in pursuing and have been pursuing in the background. But that's why I ran the IGDA. Now, the Global Game Jam, that event emerged from the IGDA. It was created by the IGDA's Game Education Special Interest Group way back in 2008. And so the Global Game Jam quickly became so big that they decided to part ways with the IGDA and become their own nonprofit entity, which they did in 2012. So ironically, when I took over the IGDA, it was right as the Global Game Jam was exiting to become their own nonprofit. And so I kind of oversaw that exit from the IGDA. And then, 2 years after I left the IGDA role, the founders of Global Game Jam came to me and said, hey, we're looking for a new executive director. We would really love for you to take the job. And I love the event. It's just such a phenomenal event. I mean, you're talking about the world's largest game creation event. It's won the Guinness World Record for being that. And that world record was like at least 10 years ago. The event is much bigger now than it was then. But the multicultural aspect of it, the community of it, everything about it I've always loved. And so it was not difficult to agree to take that role. And so I took that role basically with the goal of kind of getting the Global Game Jam into a position where it can succeed more on the long term. And that's what I felt I did after 3 years. And then when I stepped down in 2022, because I was getting way too busy with other things, including my consulting, I still am on the board. Even today, I'm still on the board of the Global Game Jam. So I still get to interact with them.
We personally met, you and me, I think it was 2012 or 2013 at SIGGRAPH for the first time.
Yeah.
When back in the day I gave some City Engine presentations there, we were working on the SIGGRAPH booth. But about 2 or 3 years ago, we were actually in contact where you were helping with the co-organization of the ICE conference, the ICE 3D Environment Conference. And I remember in the discussions that we had, you also gave very, very valuable inputs there on the topics of inclusion and the whole diversity and inclusion topic. And I remember those discussions very vividly, and I took a lot of the information that I knew from them. I took them to heart, and I learned a lot. And so from those times, I obviously remember that you're deeply invested in those topics. And so kind of to bridge back to the aspect of culturalization. So when creating content or let's say games, are there ways to anticipate and prevent things which are misinterpreted or taken out of context, which may be considered offensive? You briefly mentioned this before. You cannot make everybody happy. There's always going to be a few people that will be offended, that will hate you on Twitter. That's just the world we're living in, right? But one of those examples that comes to my mind that I think is really hard to catch. And I'm trying to find some strategies to learn personally, also some strategies, how to kind of avoid potential conflict by getting smarter. And one of the examples is that I didn't see coming is in the movie adaptations of The Lord of the Rings, that, for example, the orcs, because of their black skin, dark skin, some people misinterpreted this with kind of real world politics, going from the fantasy world to the real world into saying, why are the orcs black? Is this some sort of sign of racism?
Right.
What are there any strategies on that?
Yeah, there definitely are. I mean, a lot of times, I mean, and part of what I try and do with the clients I work with is get them to a point of awareness. You have to kind of have this develop, and it's something you develop and have to practice. It doesn't just happen. It's developing an eye and an ear for kind of that extra range of sensitivity that may exist in something. And it's really hard for creators. It's why oftentimes it is helpful to have someone like myself or other consultants from the outside who have they don't have a vested interest in your project. They are objective because they're coming in from the outside, and they will see things that you just don't see because so many creators are so close to their creation, and for good reason. I mean, they're giving birth to their child. I mean, I totally get it. They're not going to see the flaws in their own child, but somebody else will. And it's hard. It's a hard process to go through, because I've dealt with a lot of things like this. Like, that's a great example with the dark-skinned orcs, about how that can be perceived as a form of either latent or explicit racism that's being built in. You could say, well, that's just the way they are. It's just like we could have made them like bright yellow fluorescent skin instead, but it's like that's just not what they are. Plus, but that does raise really valid questions about, are they evil? Or like in the whole universe there is like darker skin equate to more of an evil character versus light skin. I mean, you think about like in the Fellowship of the Ring, they're all different races, but they're all white. Every one of the nine characters, they're all white people, even though they are different races. So, you kind of got to ask, like, interesting. And I know, when to take that example a little further, you saw how in the Rings of Power series on Amazon, they really tried to break that criticism of Tolkien, because there is criticism directly against Tolkien for being racist. And so I think Rings of Power really was striving to show that, in much the same way that honestly Star Trek The Next Generation did when they had multi-ethnic Klingons. Worf was a black Klingon versus other Klingons who seemed to be from more of a Caucasian background. And nobody screamed about that. Nobody was angry about it. It just kind of made sense. Just like there's black Vulcans and white Vulcans and things like that. So I thought it was interesting that even in the Star Trek universe, they decided to essentially replicate, or better replicate, the diversity we see in our world among our own races. Or I should say ethnicities. We're all one race, but the different ethnicities. Then they emulated that with Klingons. They did it with Romulans, and so on and so on. And nobody really complained about it. But then when the Rings of Power came out and they decided to do the exact same thing with dwarves and with elves and with other people, some people on the internet just lost their shit over it, which is just... To me, it's kind of bizarre, because it's like, okay, so it's totally cool in the Star Trek universe to do that, and nobody complains, but then it's a big problem to do it with Tolkien. I mean, I did not have a problem with it at all, because it just kind of made sense to me, because it did try and help break that idea that, essentially the light-skinned people are heroes and the dark-skinned people are not. Having that kind of sensitivity is something that we need to think about when we're designing characters, when we're building a world, and thinking about the interrelationship between what the character looks like and what is at their disposal. Like, are the lighter skinned people the higher tech people with all the fancy stuff, and the darker skinned people aren't? We really have to kind of think on that level and take a really high altitude view of our own work in order to kind of get that perspective. And a lot of that will happen, again, by asking someone outside of the project, even if it's within the same company, you can ask people outside of the project. We did that all the time at Microsoft as a larger company, which is very diverse with its employees. We met many times we did focus groups within the company because everybody's already under an NDA, so you don't have to worry about that. So we would bring in people from different cultural and ethnic groups to give us feedback on the characters that we're designing, and we would get fantastic feedback. We do this obviously early enough in the product cycle, so you're doing it during the concept phase, so that it's really easy for you to make changes rather than wait until it's too late. But having a lot of that, it's that constant reinforcement of having to do the work. I mean, BioWare is a great example where I've been working with them for so long that a lot of the people at BioWare, because they knew that this is something that is important to them, it's part of their values. Representation and inclusivity is a big part of BioWare's values and always has been. They've been very progressive in a lot of their games with showing, for example, LGBTQ relationships and so on, and that's a big deal to them, and so they strive to make that happen. And so the employees in the company have an understanding of what the values are, and it kind of guides them that we need to do a better job at this and need to be conscious of it. And having that level of consciousness, like active consciousness about what can be sensitive, is something that you have to train, and it takes a lot of time. I have that, of course, because I've been doing this work for over 30 years. I didn't have it when I first started. I had to train myself to do it. And a lot of the training was just repetition by having to do these issues over and over and over again. And now it's at a point where, at least for me, I cannot turn it off. It's like I instantly, if I see anything, my eyes are instantly looking for things that could be potentially problematic. Whether it's a famous painting or a drawing someone's kid did or whatever, I can't help it.
No, it makes sense, right? Sure, it's also your profession. You've been doing this for a long time and very, very intensely. But also, what's fascinating to me is, when was Lord of the Rings released? I think it was in the early 50s, right?
Yeah, because The Hobbit was like in the 1930 something, and then the Lord of the Rings came later.
Yeah, it came quite a lot later. But then, so in the 50s, and now the first, let's say, just the first Lord of the Rings was also like 20 years ago. And now I personally didn't see the Rings of Power. I just saw some trailers because I don't have the subscription for this service. I think it was in Amazon Prime or so. But then again, you see kind of the time scale of how long it takes for things to change in general society. Like the general kind of, you could say, value system of those things 50 years ago were massively different. Then 20 years ago, also it seemed to be, these topics were less known in public because there was also less social media, right? But then also the more progressive TV series, like for example, Star Trek, I think they had the opportunity and they did really well to look into those topics, but also certainly for creating a more rich world and talk about societal issues through their stories.
That's part of the key. I think you hit it right there, is that the societal change that we have gone through also makes a big difference. The fact that the original Star Trek show in the 60s, just like the original Twilight Zone show in the 60s, they, in my opinion, were masters of allegory. They did it so well. And I still think that many game designers and writers and others should watch those shows as examples of how to do excellent allegory. But they had to do it. They didn't have a choice, because the standards back then is that you could not talk about these certain topics. You would not talk openly about the Cold War or about racism. I mean, you think about the context when those shows came out, they were in such a time of turmoil, especially in the US around race relations. We also had the moon race and the Cold War and all this other stuff that was going on, and nuclear threat, all of these themes that were happening. And yet they did a really nice job of navigating how they present those themes to an audience, but in a science fiction or fantasy context. And yet the point still got across very, very well. And that was just that's the power of allegory that we leverage. But today, we don't have those restrictions. Today, we can talk openly about pretty much anything within reason. We have that ability. So I think that is part of the advantage we have today, is that we basically don't have have those constraints as much. I mean, yeah, there are, some, country-based and regional-based constraints that you will have. But for the most part, I mean, most creators are not restrained in that way.
No, only mentally, kind of, or not
Yeah.
mentally in the sense of that. Typically, but I guess that's a human thing, that, let's say, people that are more in or typically in charge of, let's say, productions or storylines or kind of
Right.
setting budgets, they typically tend to be older, have an older, let's say, value system that may be considered antiquated
Yes.
by the younger generation, and then kind of mix this whole thing mixing with social media just generates a lot of friction, which we obviously see. But I think we're on a good path to understanding the topics better and addressing
I agree.
them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're in a far better space today of having, we're having open dialogues about what all of this means and about what cultural appropriation means and all the other complexities around it. And it's really important that we have the conversation openly. But there's a lot of voices that have not been listened to, a lot of marginalized voices and underrepresented voices that have incredible things to say and incredible viewpoints to share. And I think we're finally, I would like to hope, getting into a mode where we are willing to listen. We meaning like mainstream society or whatever you want to call it, European dominated society, whatever the term might be.
Yeah. Oh, which also allows for new, let's say, fresh blood in fresh types of stories, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Let's jump back to maps and maps in games. So something that is very, very fascinating to me is, just as an example, as a quick segue, is the process of this kind of shrinking a real world city into a representation so that it fits in a game story better. So some of these examples are Spider-Man with New York kind of around Central Park. Another one of those games was Watch Dogs, where there's kind of this iconic representation of San Francisco, but it's not to real scale. But let's say the main landmarks were kept, kind of the main city blocks and so on, but the rest was pretty much shrunk. And so in this combination between geography and gameplay, and kind of shrinking the games also to make this kind of the story or the experience better, the narrative better, so that you don't have to drive so far, but you still have the impression of a specific place.
Yes.
This as an example, kind of extending on this thought, what do you think makes a game map or a game level good?
Oh, that's a great question. I think there's a real art form to map creation within a game. Level design is, of course, its own field. There's people who are game designers and there's people who are specifically level designers because they are focused on this very issue of like, how do you design a level in a way that forwards the narrative and basically brings all the elements that you want to bring together, but makes it compelling and interesting. I remember in my days working on the original Halo games, how they would use heat maps when they do user tests, and they see heat maps of where the users go and how the level's working and what the user's perceiving in the environment. And I just always found that fascinating because they would find that, sometimes it's like one object that's in the environment that's causing confusion to the players. Like I remember there was one map, I think it was Halo 3, where you start the map and you're looking out at the landscape and players thought that they could go up a path to the left. And so they were wondering, why is there such a big heat blob right at the beginning of the map and nobody's like leaving? And it's because everyone keeps thinking they can jump up there because it looks like you can, but you can't. So everyone would just stand there and still try and try and try. And so basically, they fixed it by just adding like boulders or trees or something. So it's super obvious that you cannot go that way. So sometimes it's something that subtle, just one thing that causes a perception. And plus, let's face it, as human beings, when we're in an environment, whether it's real or virtual, we like to go where you're not supposed to go. We try and go off the path. All of us have done it or have tried it. It's just something that we do. We forge our own paths, and it's something that game players especially love to do, which is, I think, one of the reasons why open world games are becoming more and more popular today. But I think making a map level good is really about, it has to come down to what serves the narrative. But it has to be, that's first and foremost. If the level doesn't serve the narrative, then it isn't good, in my view. But the other part of that is it has to be interesting enough so that, depending on the type of game you're playing, it really has to serve the purpose of the player in terms of what they're after. Because yes, you might be on that level to do a specific task, to fight a certain boss or something like that, but you also want to give them agency to basically do stuff that they want to do. I mean, like, for example, my style of gameplay, I love open world games. I love discovery. That's like the number one thing I live for in games, and which is one of the reasons why I loved Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom so much, as well as Skyrim and other games like that, because I love the ability to just go wherever I want. And the designers of the game were smart enough to make sure, knowing that people would do that, that there is stuff that you will find off the beaten path all over the place. There's all kinds of little magical things and little artifacts and other stuff that you find that basically gives you a payoff for why you went off the path. And I think that's really what it's often about. It's about that balance between keeping the player focused on the goal of that level and to forward the narrative, but you also want to make sure there's enough payoff if they do decide to diverge and to go off in different angles or whatever. Give them something to do, give them something to take a look at. I mean, I know some of the complaints of some of the earlier first-person shooter games is that they're so linear, is basically, which, Halo was like that too, I admit, even though I thought the levels were super cool, but it's a pretty linear game. There's really only one path that you can take through there. It's really compelling and it's fun, but it's only one path, and you can't really figure out alternatives. So I think that, to me, is kind of where the balance lies.
Now, two of the terms that we used before are experience and narrative, and I picked this up actually in one of your presentations, that you specifically distinguish between their meaning. Can you give us a rundown of your definition of the two things?
Yeah. So to me, the narrative is essentially that essentially is the reason for the world to exist. It's like you are telling a story, and that's what games are for. They're for telling a story. And so that's really what it's about. What's the plot? Who comes out in the end? What happens? It's all of that stuff. So that, to me, is really what the narrative is. The experience is what the player goes through as they pursue the narrative. What do you actually do in pursuit of the narrative? If you have a goal, so what do you do? Is it in space? Is it, are you in a medieval armor? I mean, do you have a sword? Do you have a, lightsaber? I mean, all the other aspects of how the narrative is pursued, to me, is what the experience is all about. And that can vary widely. And of course, they are completely intertwined. They have to be, because you want the experience to complement the narrative. It can't be incongruous in some way. But really, that, to me, that's the difference. And I think some people might say it's a bit subtle, but to me, it's pretty straightforward. It's like, if I read the script of a game I'm working on, that script is the narrative, and then when I actually look at the environments, the artifacts, the costumes, the options, do a playthrough of the level, all of that kind of stuff, that's the experience. I mean, you can have a great experience in a game without ever pursuing the narrative. And I've done that many times. I mean, Grand Theft Auto 5, I start up the game to play it, and all I do is like steal cars or steal planes and goof around, and I like end up never doing the narrative. But I'm still having fun. I'm having a great time. It's just I'm not doing the narrative. So
I very often also see the trap that there's this mix-up between kind of world size or map size and visual fidelity, that this seems kind of mixed up in that these are good games. Now, in your experience, what would you say are typically the most underestimated factors for creating consistent narratives that are also interesting?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, because I don't think the size of a map it doesn't matter. That doesn't mean it's a better game just because you've got more stuff in there. In fact, in my experience, especially doing culturalization work, the more room you have to put stuff, the more room for error there is. And so constraint is a very undervalued proposition within game design, because especially today, because we can make gigantic worlds, we can procedurally generate them, we can do all kinds of amazing things pretty easily today. But I still think constraint is a magic that more developers need to learn, because constraint really drives innovation, I think, in a lot of ways. For example, Ed Fries, who was basically launched the Xbox while he was VP at Microsoft, and he oversaw Halo and all those other games back then. He wrote a great article several years back about his game he made called Halo 2600. So he made a version of Halo for the Atari 2600, and it's hilarious. You can play it online. I think you can actually go to like halo2600.com. But what was great is that he wrote a piece that appeared, I think, on the game developer website some years back, in which he was talking about why constraint was so powerful in helping him design the game, because he could not do everything he wanted because he's dealing with the constraints of Atari 2600 computing. And so he had to make really deliberate decisions about what he was going to do in the environment, with the character design, everything. And so it really forced him to think through all of that through. It's honestly no different from my early days of cartography, because when I started cartography, we were not doing it on computers. We were doing it taking India ink on Mylar sheets and drawing the maps on a Mylar sheet, which would then be photo reduced down to the size of the map. Now, when you're sitting there looking at a blank sheet of Mylar and you're going to have India ink, which is a pain in the butt to get off if you draw the wrong line, you think through the entire map design in your head. You internalize everything before you commit to actually putting it on the Mylar. And I think that process is something that has been lost by not doing more manual methods, because today we can do digital iterations like over and over and over and over again. But I don't know if doing the digital iterations really teaches you the internalization of the process of design. And so, I think that's a really important aspect of it. And I think as we're creating maps for games and creating levels, we have to be really mindful of, like, just because you can put in everything, do you really need to put in everything? What constraints can you put on yourself? And that's why I often tell clients I work with, I said, your goal should be to basically use the most minimal amount of content to convey the narrative. To think about what are the absolute requirements, the very few things you need in the environment to convey the narrative, and then you can build on that. But don't go the other way around where say we're going to have the giant forest and village and city and blah, 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 and then we'll figure out how the narrative fits in there. It's like, start the other way around. So basically, I'm trying to say that I think it's better if you constrain yourself early and act as if you have those constraints, and then you can kind of build out from there.
I've been in many meetings where kind of this approach coming from the wrong side was addressed, because, it's kind of the analogy that I usually have is kind of a cat and a laser pointer with, something shiny technology. Can we use that to basically start with a huge world, but then the lack of ideas of how to fill them?
Yes.
Which brings me to generative AI.
Ah, yes.
So with the rise of tools like, for example, ChatGPT, creating larger and more consistent, let's say, storylines and kind of tools around controlling all of those things, I actually see that with all of those advantages of that AI tools are bringing to the table, I also see that the danger with introducing critical elements that could be overlooked in the context of, for example, culturalization. They might just be sneaking in. And there's this kind of, let's say, peer pressure also of wanting to create bigger games, wanting to create more complex storylines. And also those, or at least the current generation of AI tools, are not just able to catch all of those things. Would you also say that you see those dangers, and how would you advise to avoid them?
Obviously generative AI has been a huge topic in the game industry. Massive topics. Like, basically what most people are talking about, other than those who were lucky enough to get an Apple Vision Pro recently. um, which I actually had a demo of yesterday, and it is pretty phenomenal, but I'm not paying that much. But yeah, the generative AI, I mean, it's been a very hot topic for a lot of good reasons. I mean, it does raise questions about the utility of humans in the creative process and things like that. But, obviously, as we all know, generative AI is trained on human artwork. It's not creating stuff on its own. It's trained on a lot of existing artwork, which is where the core of the controversy is, and the trademark and copyright questions that arise from that. But at the same time, I think it's an incredible tool that can be leveraged really well. That I've seen, for example, I know a couple of artists who have embraced it, who are longtime artists in the game industry, who feel that it can help them with iterations of their own work. And in one case, I know an artist who trained the AI only on their work. So it's not taking from other sources, it's only using their artwork as a basis. Yeah. So they feel more comfortable that now it's truly become a tool for me, that it's using my artwork only. And now what it's generating is basically my style. Mm-hmm. And I think in that context, I think it's great. When it starts borrowing from other sources especially without knowledge or compensation, then obviously I think that's a huge problem. But I do think, in terms of culturalization, it's funny because when some of these tools emerged last year, I had some colleagues saying, oh, you're going to be out of a job in a few years. And I'm like, no, I won't. Trust me, I won't. I'm not going to be out of a job, because as powerful and as visually impressive as these tools are, the contextual complications of things are far beyond its capabilities at this point. Will it get there someday? Probably. Yeah, I don't doubt it. But the kind of work that I deal with, and even some of the examples we've talked about, there's so much subtlety in there. I mean, it's like you cannot build black and white rules on a lot of these cultural issues because they are so contextually specific. I mean, really specific in a way that I think at the moment only humans could really discern what that contextual difference would be, especially between different cultures. And so I feel no threat from the technology. I do see ways where this technology can even help me in my work, but I really haven't had time to play around with it too much. But I have tested ChatGPT quite a bit with different questions around culture and such. And it does an okay job, but it definitely is not perfect, not even close. So I think a lot of it, what it comes down to is the ethical use of this technology, which is true of any technology that we employ, especially when it can directly impact employment. We do need to look at it from an ethical lens and say, is this the right way to go about this? It doesn't mean that we don't use the tool or we shun it completely, because let's face it, it's not going away. It's going to be used, and there's a lot of companies who are already using it. I know a lot of indie game studios who are very heavily using it because they need that leg up. They don't have the resources to do everything they want, and the AI tools out there are giving them a huge advantage that they didn't have even a year ago, and they feel that if they don't use it, that they're going to be at a disadvantage. And I think that's a lot of the struggle that people are feeling now. It's like, am I going to be potentially left behind if I don't embrace this technology, which on some levels, understandably so. Some people I just abhor this idea, and yet I can't avoid it.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely see this also. And kind of at the moment, exactly what you're describing, I would name this kind of some sort of AI limbo state.
Yes.
That is paralyzing. On the one hand side, on the potential of helpful, enabling, but also kind of, what the hell am I doing here, right? And
exactly.
It seems we're at the moment right in the middle of this kind of realization as a society that technology is progressing much faster than societal structures can actually adapt. And that is extremely scary. And with that, I don't know where to get help. That's something even for myself. It's kind of obviously all these discussions are part of everybody's struggle at the moment, but there's also no resources on how do we deal with this, right? What would you recommend how to deal with this, or how do you deal with it yourself?
Well, I think, it's funny. Well, it's not funny. It's just interesting. I was talking with somebody on a podcast not too long ago, and I was drawing the comparison between, the movie Oppenheimer and the AI tools that have emerged last year. Because as we have a movie that was incredibly successful talking about the creation of the first atomic bomb. And I love the fact that the movie dealt a lot with the implications and how Oppenheimer himself struggled with what he knew would be the implications of if this gets out and if this becomes like a wider available tool, what's going to happen to the world, and the world's going to change. And it certainly did. And I think we're facing a similar moment today but I think it's even in some ways worse, because while the atomic bomb and the nuclear programs and everything else that came after it was a massive government, country level endeavor that had to be, implemented for defense or whatever else, whatever reasons. This is something that's happening more like the spread of COVID-19. It is a viral spread. It is not something that requires government capital investment and years of development. This is something that's right now. It's happening at this moment. It's iterating so quickly. It really does feel almost like it's slipping beyond our fingertips already. And it's only been a year. That's the crazy thing. These tools have only been around for a year, and we've already seen such an incredible evolution of the tools and what they can do. And I would agree that this is kind of another sort of Manhattan Project moment for us, where we have to think about, what are we going to do about this? I think one of the ways to cope is that we as creators need to talk to each other about it and basically openly discuss how we're using the tools. There's been AI forums that have popped up where people are discussing things. I'm glad to see that there was, I believe this week, or was it this week or last week, when they announced a consortium of major companies, like major tech companies who are coming together to essentially discuss more or less the ethical implications and application of AI moving forward, because we can't just let this out of the bag so quickly. And yet oftentimes the only way to control that is through some form of government intervention. But as we know, governments are usually at least 10 or 20 years behind, even though surprisingly, I've seen some people in the US government talking about AI and complaining about the implications of it. But I mean, they can't even get a vote pushed through Congress on simple things, let alone something like AI. So I have no hope for the US government that they would even address it anytime soon before it's way, way too late. So I think a lot of it is this dialogue has to be one way that we cope with this. It's the same way that happened during the Cold War. We have open discussions about this and debates about the use of it, because there are opinions all over the place. And I think it has to start there. There has to be dialogue that continues, and without fear of any kind of retribution or backlash, which is kind of hard to do these days because there's always backlash for some reason. But there needs to be some kind of dialogue, because I know how many people in the game industry are feeling that limbo state and kind of wondering, will my job be around in another year or two? Because if it's iterating this quickly and evolving this fast, and people are encouraging it to do so, especially that people who are very actively using it and actively creating it, then what is it going to look like? And I mean, for the culturalization implications, it's even scarier, because now we've got Russia wants to develop their own chat GPT version, and China's got their own version. And those come with their own cultural and geopolitical assumptions that are definitely divergent from the tools that we're using in the West. And so it becomes a pretty scary proposition in terms of what lies ahead for this technology.
And it's also a vicious circle, right? So because everybody is kind of in this limbo state and in thinking about the existential threat that it generates or showcases, everybody thinks they have to start using the technology to potentially giving them this final advantage, which in general is just it's a vicious circle.
Yes.
Because out of the fear, people think, okay, now I have to rush, which fuels the beast.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, and so hopefully, I'm glad to see a lot of people pushing back on it.
Mm.
Even though I do think ultimately, the tools are going to find a way to be incorporated, but as long as they're done so in an ethical and responsible way, I don't think we should fear it. We just have to take a step back and understand, how is this going to impact our processes, and how is it going to impact human skill sets moving forward? Because we don't want to lose the ability to do these
Yeah.
things, a generation or two from now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. And kind of regarding the resources on the stuff, I mean, there's only, for the general population, there's only kind of the forums talking to each other and making people aware of the potential implications and kind of standing together.
Right.
I absolutely see it like that. But let's continue just talking, because we've been talking for quite some time now. And
Yes.
I don't want to take all too much of your time, but there are a few more questions. And one of those
Okay.
topics is set chatters, which is a really, really fascinating endeavor that you started some time ago. So please tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so set jetters is basically the child of one of my many hobbies that I have, and this is one of my favorite hobbies, which is when I travel, which I travel about 75% of the year to speak at events around the world. The joke is that my stuff is in Seattle, but I'm not there very often. So, but when I do travel, one of the things I love to do is visit where my favorite TV shows and films have been made. So visiting filming locations. And so that's what they call set jetting. It's a term that's been around for a while now, or you can just call it film tourism. But set jetting has been really popular. And actually, there's been studies done by Expedia and like travel associations that show that right now, set jetting is like one of the primary reasons why people travel. They see a film or excuse me, they see a location in a film or a TV show and they want to go there. And that's what inspires their travel decisions when they have a holiday. And so for me, growing up in Southern California, obviously I'm near Hollywood and I'm surrounded by tons of filming locations. And so it was really fun for me to do that. I think there's a special kind of magic that happens. And maybe this also is because one of the reasons I became a geographer, because the sense of place that comes with it. But it's not just a sense of the place where they filmed it. It's a kind of a magic that happens because they transformed that space by overlapping a narrative on top of it. And it's a narrative that I really love. It's something that has meaning for me. So, for example, when I was in southern Tunisia a few years back and I visited the original Lars Homestead set from the original Star Wars film, and that's where they filmed it in southern Tunisia. And the hut, the Skywalker, the Aunt and Uncle Beru, their house is still there. It's still there. It's every once in a while some fans go and they kind of fix it up again because it falls apart every once in a while because it is on a dry lake bed that does flood every once in a while. But it's just, for me, it was like a religious experience. I was weak in the knees. I was tearing up because I could not believe that I was in the very place where that movie was filmed so many years ago, a film that means so much to me. I was only 12 years old when the very first Star Wars film came out. And so had a massive impact on my life and a lot of people of that generation because we had never seen anything like it before. I mean, ever. And so there was a real magic that happens when I'm in that place and I'm like, all of the emotions you feel about the meaning that the media has for you kind of comes to life in that moment. And it's a cool feeling. And it's just like, not all the locations you visit can be that meaningful for you. But for example, I mean, in Astoria, Oregon, where they filmed The Goonies, which is still for many people a favorite film, every year in May, they have a Goonies Day in Astoria, Oregon, and thousands of people from around the world go to Astoria to celebrate that film. And there's the Goonies house. It looks exactly like it did in the movie years ago. We know the owner of the house who bought it recently and is restoring it to be like the original house as it was in the movie. But people, because they love that film so much, they want to be there. They want to be a part of it. In the same way that the film Stand By Me from the 80s was also filmed in Oregon, in Brownsville, which is a tiny little town in the middle of Oregon. And yet every July 23rd is Stand By Me Day, and thousands of people converge on this town to celebrate that film. Because for a lot of people who were growing up with that movie, it meant a lot to them because the film was about coming of age. And so there's just so many examples of that. Like if you're in London, there's filming locations everywhere, like just everywhere for James Bond, Harry Potter, Bourne Identity, you name it. I mean, there's so many locations there. And it's so for a lot of people, it's really exciting for them to get to go to the place. So when COVID hit, I wasn't traveling like most people. I was home for 18 months, which had not happened in many, many years for me. And I had already partnered with 4 other people, my co-founders. And we basically had the idea, let's create an app to help people find filming locations, because it's something that, I definitely love to do. And they were also interested in doing it, because 3 of my co-founders are from the film industry. And then our other one is from tech, like me. So we got together, we raised money, we raised about 100K US, and we had the app created. It's been out on the app stores on Android and Apple for the last 3 years. And we're just building our community, and we're building features and seeking investment and all that fun stuff. But it's been great. It's been really fun to share this activity with other people, and to give them a tool that was designed by SetJetter people who know what it's like to go out there. And the feedback has been phenomenal. So we're really excited. So I never thought that this hobby would turn into a business, but there you go.
These are the best businesses, right?
Yeah, I agree.
So is it only regarding, or kind of let's say the focus of the app, or kind of the whole vision of SetJetters is specifically regarding real physical film sets kind of on this planet? Or is there also kind of a virtual aspect to it, or at least, or maybe planned to have virtual representations, or let's say 3D scans, or quote-unquote digital twins of those also available for those that, I don't know, are too busy to travel? Is that something you can share or not?
Well, it's definitely on our roadmap. I'll put it that way. We definitely have plans to have both AR and VR representation of these places. Like I said, I tried out the Apple Vision Pro yesterday, and the spatial video feature is amazing. Yeah. It really is quite cool. So I could easily see how we could go to a filming location and capture it in spatial video and have it presentable, whether in a VR headset or a Vision Pro or whatever, and give people the ability to go. Because let's face it, a lot of people cannot go, whether it's for financial reasons or accessibility reasons. There's a lot of valid reasons why people can't visit these places, and yet we would love to still share those with people. So yeah, all of those kind of representations are definitely in our roadmap, including not just for the sake of allowing people to go, but also for the sake of preservation, because a lot of these sites are, they're not going to be around forever. They are falling apart due to climate change or other environmental or human factors. So it'd be great to capture them before they're gone.
Yeah. I really like the idea of the preservation, because especially also for other historical sites, I've been working on some of those projects. That's really, really an important aspect. Now, we've been talking a lot about games over the last couple of hours. So do you think also fictional virtual tourism could be a thing, kind of like staying in the Star Wars universe that we mentioned a couple of times, kind of for people to meet at the, let's say, Mos Eisley Cantina or kind of quote unquote in the metaverse? Do you think this might also be something, or let's say meet in the Halo world, or as an extension to that? Do you also see that?
Oh yeah, no question about it. I mean, we are heading there already. Yeah, I mean, it's just when we see both this happening in the physical world as well as the virtual world. I mean, you've got when you've got Disney building Star Wars Land, and if you've never been there, it's amazing. It's amazing representation that's very immersive. There's nothing like seeing a full-scale Millennium Falcon just sitting right in front of you. It's pretty awesome. So there's a recognition that these kind of environments are very appealing to people, both physically and virtually. And so I think we're going to continue to see both, because what it really comes down to is immersion. Yeah. People love the idea of immersion, whether it's physical or virtual. So I think there's going to be a massive, massive market for that kind of thing as we move forward.
Yeah, that's so cool. I didn't try the Apple Vision Pro yet, but I think when I get my hands on them, maybe, I don't know, maybe at SIGGRAPH or so, because in Europe getting access to them is super limited at the moment. But I hope I'm going to be blown away. All right, just briefly about your future. I also read that you're working on a culturalization handbook.
Yes.
Can you share a few insights on that?
Yeah, so this is something I've been working on for too long. I'll put it that way. I've wanted to do it for the last 10 years at least, but it's basically a culmination of a lot of my learnings and understandings about doing culturalization on media, more on games than anything else, but it does apply to other media as well. So basically what it's going to be is it's not encyclopedic. It's not going to give you every kind of thing you need to watch out for because that would be just too big. And, there's a lot, that's what Wikipedia and other things are for. What it's going to be about is like, how do you handle certain kinds of content? How do you handle maps? How do you handle flags? How do you handle gestures? What do you do about faith systems? What do you do about political systems, ethnic representation, cultural appropriation, all of these different things. And so basically I'm planning for it to be a very useful book. I want it to be spiral bound. So it basically is the kind of thing that sits on your desk. There's going to be tab sections. So you can easily tab to the section you want because that's what you're working on that day. And it'll be kind of laid out for you very simply about here's the top things you need to know about this topic. Here's some explanation. Here's a good example. Here's a bad example. And then perhaps some pointing to different resources. And that's pretty much it. That's about it, but it's a huge undertaking. So I've been working on it for quite a while. The other part that I'm building into the book is that it's going to also be a cultural experience in itself. Because as much as I know game developers very, very well, I also know that a lot of people aren't just going to sit down and read the text. Yeah. However, I'm building in a 5-part manga inside the book. So it's a graphic novel style manga, and the back cover of the handbook is actually the front cover of the manga. So you will be reading it from right to left as you do in Japan when you're reading manga. So you're basically going to have a cultural experience built into the book. And basically the manga is dramatizing in kind of Twilight Zone fashion what happens to you if you don't do what the book says. And so basically, by the time you finish the manga, you're at the beginning of the handbook, and now you can actually read and find out the right thing to do. So I think it's going to be a fun book for people. So I'm working on that. I don't know when it's going to come out, but that's basically what I'm working on right now.
Oh, that's awesome. I can't wait to get my hands on that book. Because, as we've seen, like, not considering these topics is very dangerous. So I think it's definitely something everybody should have. Everybody that creates content. That's amazing. Now, you mentioned before, you're 75% of your time you're traveling. You're also finishing your PhD slowly. You're working on a book. What else fun is coming up for you? Otherwise, more plans?
Yeah, I think that's the bulk of it right now. I mean, really right now my time is divided between my consulting work, which is my geography company, the Set Cheddar startup, and then traveling and speaking. And beyond that, it's like very little time left over. I don't know when my PhD is going to get finished. I don't need it at this point, but it'd be nice to finish it still. I also want to get a pilot's license. I've wanted to do that for decades, and I've never have. I don't know when I'm going to do that either, but we'll see. I'll get there eventually. But right now, it's basically just balancing those many things that I'm dealing with.
It's definitely not going to get boring.
No.
If you'd start your own game franchise where you could dictate everything, unlimited funds, what would it be?
Oh, that's a hard one. There's a lot of ones I would want to do. I think I do have this funny thing. I've worked on over 270 games in my career, but I have never made an actual game myself because I don't have programming skills. I mean, yeah, I could spend time learning Unity or whatever, but I haven't done that because I don't have the time to do it. But I have some game ideas. I have a few ideas for things I would want to do. I think as far as a franchise, I think one that I think would be fun to do is something based on the film Galaxy Quest. the Star Trek parody. I love Galaxy Quest. I think it's an amazing movie. It's such a great love letter to Star Trek fans, but it's not Star Trek. It's just a comedic parody of Star Trek. But I think it'd be really fun to do a game based on that movie.
I don't know that movie. I'll definitely go check it out.
I highly recommend it. It's from 1999. It's got Tim Allen and Sigourney Weaver and Alan Rickman and other great actors are in it. It's just really damn funny. It's very funny.
That's quite the cast.
It is. Yeah. It's a great movie.
Awesome. All right. Let's just very briefly dive into the last final 3 questions that I always ask. So if you have to recommend one book everybody should read, which one would it be and why?
Oh, so many good books. I would have to say, though, this is probably an answer other people might give, but my answer would be Dune by Frank Herbert. It is my favorite sci-fi book by far. I've read it many, many times. I'm a huge fan of that universe for many reasons. I love it appeals to me in many ways because it is another incredible example of world building. It's on par with Tolkien, in my opinion. And the world of Dune, it appeals to me a little bit more because it's sci-fi. I've always kind of favored sci-fi a little bit more than fantasy books, even though I love Tolkien, but sci-fi just resonates with me a bit more. And the way that he handled very complicated themes around religion and politics and society and culture and all of that in a far-flung future for humanity, which isn't necessarily a good future either, but it just fascinates me. The world building in that book is just amazing, and honestly, I thought the Part 1 movie that came out a few years ago was great. It was a great adaptation, and I'm really looking forward to the new movie next week, the Part 2. But I would really highly recommend people read it because. Just like any film, I mean, the film is great, but the book is better. I mean, there's so much more subtlety in the book and nuance that I think is definitely worth reading.
Yeah. I read the book a few years back, and what I really liked about it, and I was literally waiting for years and years for a new film adaptation, and it finally happened. And what I really liked in the new one by Villeneuve is that it's actually so kind of close to the original story of the book.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna in about 2 weeks I'm gonna also see the new one. But
nice.
What's really interesting is that Tolkien didn't like it. I saw this just very recently that he didn't like it at all. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I mean, everything I've read of Tolkien and interviews I've read of him, he, as creative as he was kind of an old curmudgeon too.
All right. Now, this is one of my good friends, Mike Shawbrook, actually mentioned that this next question sounds a little bit like a Miss Universe question, but I really like the question. So if you could change one thing on this planet to make it a better place, what would it be?
Oh, to me, that's an easy one. I wish humans had better empathy towards each other. I wish empathy was actually like a sense that you feel like pain, because empathy to me is the key to understanding other people and understanding other cultures, because like I said before, we are one human race, and that's it. This is all there is. And I think the ability to have empathy and understand the pain of other people and not sympathy, because sympathy is easy. That's just, I feel bad for you. It's like, no, having empathy to actually feel what other people are going through. I think that would be a world of difference if people could actually feel each other's pain in a more explicit way. Because without that, we just become dead to each other. We're just like so numb to what other people are going through. And it's easy for us, especially with wrapped in technology as we are today, to lose that sense of empathy. And if anything, that's one of the biggest downsides I see of that social media has created, is basically a destruction of any sense of empathy that exists between people, because now we're just faceless names, anonymous names on a Twitter feed or whatever, and it's really easy to just let our worst instincts come out. And yeah, it's a really unfortunate trend in my view.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. All right, last question. Who would you like to see as a guest on the 3D Environment podcast?
I was thinking about this. I would love to hear. I would love to hear the perspective of someone like Marty O'Donnell. He was the composer for the original Halo series. So he composed the music and a lot of the sound effects. I would love to hear someone like him or Alan Kaplan or some of the other like composers in the game industry or even in or audio engineers, because audio is such a major part of environments. And it would be really cool to hear their perspective on how they build environments and because I know a lot of what we've talked about, especially in culturalization work, even though there are audio components to it. Like I gave that example of the whole audio file with the Kakudo Chojin thing. A lot of it is visual. The great majority of it is all visual, but there is, of course, as we know, the audio universe that we live in is a massive part of our understanding of the environment. So I'd be curious to hear from someone like Marty or someone else in that field about how they approach these things.
Yeah, that's a very, very cool input. I will get back to you about this. And also because this, George Lucas mentioned all years ago that 50% of the experience of a movie is the sound, and thus Skywalker Studios, right? So
Absolutely.
this is a phenomenal input. Thank you so much for that.
No, I'm happy to. Well, especially I'm a movie score geek. That's pretty much all I listen to are movie scores. So yeah.
Awesome. It's been an absolute pleasure to have this conversation, to dive deep into certain things. I'm realizing more and more that my podcast, usually the episodes are much longer than other episodes, but
Yeah.
I really like doing it that way because you have a little bit more time to dive into the depths that usually there's not enough time to talk about. So thank you so much for all the invaluable inputs from your end and for the time that you have invested in this.
No, I'm happy to, and it was a great conversation. I really appreciate you inviting me. So thank you.
You are welcome. All right, then let's wrap it up. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.